On most nights, the restaurant glowed with the quiet confidence of Manhattan success. Crystal glasses, soft jazz, couples leaning close over candlelight. Daniel Carter expected nothing more complicated than a polite dinner after a long day in court. But across the room, under the amber glow of a chandelier, he saw his wife laughing softly, her hand resting in another man's. The kind of touch that lingered half a second too long to be innocent. Some stories begin with love. Others begin with a moment that shatters everything you thought you knew. If quiet betrayals and fragile hearts intrigue you, stay a little longer, because the truth behind that table has only just begun to surface. The restaurant was the kind of place where people whispered rather than spoke. Tall windows looked out over the glittering spine of Manhattan's Upper East Side, where traffic moved like a slow ribbon of light beneath the winter sky. Inside, the air carried the soft scent of truffle oil and aged wine. Waiters in dark suits moved quietly between tables, their presence barely noticeable. Daniel Carter paused at the entrance just long enough to remove his coat. It had been a long day at the federal courthouse downtown, closing arguments in a corruption case that had consumed his last 3 months. His shoulders still carried the stiffness of courtroom tension. Dinner, he thought, would be simple. Rebecca had texted earlier saying she was meeting a client in the city. Daniel had planned to grab something quick before heading home to Brooklyn Heights. Nothing remarkable, nothing complicated. He stepped further into the restaurant, scanning the room with the unconscious alertness of someone who had spent years reading faces in courtrooms. And then he saw her. Rebecca sat at a small corner table beneath a low-hanging chandelier. The light caught the copper tones in her hair, making it glow softly against the dark velvet of her coat draped across the chair. Across from her sat a man Daniel had never seen before. Late 30s, maybe early 40s. Clean cut, expensive watch. The kind of relaxed posture that suggested confidence born from success. Rebecca leaned forward as she laughed. It wasn't the laughter that stopped Daniel. It was her hand. Her fingers rested in the man's. Not clasped tightly, not hidden, just resting there. The gesture was small enough that most people in the room would never notice. But Daniel did. He stood still for a moment, watching. The man said something Daniel couldn't hear. Rebecca smiled again, though this time her expression softened into something quieter, something intimate. 15 years of marriage had taught Daniel the language of her expressions. He knew the difference between polite laughter and genuine warmth. This was the latter. For a moment, something cold passed through his chest. Not rage, not even shock. Just clarity. Across the room, Rebecca's eyes lifted, and she saw him. The color drained from her face so quickly it almost looked theatrical. Her hand slipped away from the man's as though it had touched something hot. The man turned slightly in his chair, following her gaze. Daniel began walking toward the table. His footsteps were steady, unhurried. Every instinct he had trained as a prosecutor, years of learning how to control emotion in rooms filled with tension, rose quietly to the surface. Rebecca stood halfway from her chair. Daniel, her voice was barely louder than the jazz drifting from the speakers overhead. He reached the table and stopped. Up close, the stranger's confidence faltered just slightly. Daniel noticed everything. The faint crease forming between Rebecca's brows. The half-empty glass of red wine near her elbow. The subtle tension in the man's shoulders. Silence hovered over the table like something physical. Daniel looked first at Rebecca, then at the man, then back at Rebecca. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm. "Hi, Rebecca." She swallowed. "Daniel, I didn't expect." He nodded slightly, as though acknowledging a polite explanation that hadn't quite formed. Then he turned his attention to the man. The stranger rose halfway from his chair. "Adrian Blake," he said, extending a hand. Daniel shook it. His grip was firm, but not aggressive. "Daniel Carter." For a brief moment, Adrian's expression flickered with recognition. Federal prosecutor. The name had likely appeared in headlines more than once. Daniel released his hand and glanced briefly at the table again. 3 wine glasses. 1 candle. 2 menus pushed aside. It was the kind of arrangement couples often created without noticing. Rebecca's voice trembled slightly. "Daniel, this isn't what." Daniel raised a hand gently. not to silence her, just to pause the moment. The restaurant around them continued moving. Waiters passing, quiet laughter from distant tables, glasses clinking softly. But at this table, time had slowed. Daniel met Rebecca's eyes. And then he said the one sentence that neither of them expected. "I hope he knows you hate cilantro." The words landed strangely between them. Not accusatory, not angry, just specific. Rebecca blinked. Adrian looked confused. Daniel continued, his tone conversational. "You used to push it to the side of every plate, even when restaurants said it was part of the garnish." Rebecca's lips parted slightly. It was such an ordinary memory, and somehow that made it worse. Daniel gave a small nod toward Adrian. "She's allergic too, technically. Nothing life-threatening. Just makes her throat itch." Adrian looked down at the table. The garnish on Rebecca's plate was covered in cilantro. For a second, no one spoke. Daniel stepped back slightly. "I'll let you two finish dinner." Rebecca's voice broke. "Daniel, wait." But he was already turning. The walk back through the restaurant felt strangely quiet. Not because the room had changed, but because something inside Daniel had shifted. Outside, the cold New York air wrapped around him like a shock. Traffic moved endlessly along the avenue. Horns sounded in the distance. A taxi splashed through a puddle at the curb. Daniel stood there for a moment, breathing slowly. Inside the restaurant, through the window, he could still see the table. Rebecca hadn't sat back down yet. Adrian was speaking to her now. Daniel didn't try to read their lips. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. There was a message waiting from one of the investigators in his office. A file had just come through. It concerned a tech company under quiet federal review. The CEO's name appeared in bold letters at the top of the report. Adrian Blake. Daniel stared at the screen for several seconds. Then he slipped the phone back into his pocket. Above him, the Manhattan skyline shimmered against the winter night. Somewhere behind him, a restaurant door opened and closed. And for the first time since seeing Rebecca at that table, Daniel allowed himself to wonder whether the affair he had just witnessed was only the beginning of something far more complicated. The townhouse on Willow Street had always been Rebecca's favorite place in the city. When they bought it 12 years earlier, she had fallen in love with the tall windows facing the narrow Brooklyn street and the faint smell of old wood that lingered in the stairwell. Daniel liked to joke that the house had the quiet dignity of a retired professor, unimpressive from the outside, but filled with stories if you knew where to look. Tonight the house felt unfamiliar. Rebecca stood at the kitchen counter, staring at the kettle long after the water had begun to boil. The sound was sharp in the silence. She turned the stove off, poured the water into 2 mugs, and dropped tea bags inside. The motion was automatic, almost mechanical. Outside the window, the streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalk. A neighbor's dog barked once and then fell quiet again. The front door opened downstairs. Rebecca's shoulders stiffened. Daniel stepped into the kitchen a moment later, his coat folded neatly over one arm. He placed it over the back of a chair before loosening the tie around his neck. Neither of them spoke at first. Rebecca slid one of the mugs toward him across the counter. "Chamomile," she said quietly. Daniel looked at the mug for a second before taking it. "Thank you." His voice was neutral, the same tone he used when speaking to colleagues or strangers. That, more than anything, unsettled her. She wrapped her hands around her own mug, but didn't drink. "I didn't know you were going to be there tonight," she said. Daniel leaned lightly against the counter. "I wasn't." Rebecca nodded slowly, as if confirming a detail she already knew. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the soft ticking of the wall clock. Finally, she spoke again. "Adrian is a client. Our agency is handling a rebranding campaign for his company." Daniel's expression didn't change. "I assumed something like that." Rebecca watched his face carefully, searching for anger, disappointment, anything she could respond to. But Daniel remained composed, almost distant. "It was just dinner," she added. The words sounded thin even to her own ears. Daniel lifted the mug and took a slow sip of tea. Rebecca noticed the faint crease forming between his brows. It always appeared when he was thinking through something carefully. "Rebecca," he said after a moment, "you don't need to explain the business part." Her chest tightened. "What do you mean?" Daniel set the mug down. "I understand client dinners." He looked at her then, directly. What I don't understand is why you looked like someone who'd been caught stealing. The honesty of the sentence landed harder than anger would have. Rebecca inhaled slowly. It wasn't like that. Daniel didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked toward the large window overlooking the street. A car passed outside, headlights sweeping briefly across the living room walls. Rebecca followed him with her eyes. "What exactly did you think you saw?" she asked. Daniel rested one hand against the window frame. "I saw my wife holding hands with another man." His voice was still calm, almost thoughtful. Rebecca felt a wave of heat rise in her chest. It wasn't, she stopped herself, because she realized she didn't know how to finish the sentence. "Not exactly." Daniel turned back toward her. "You know what surprised me most?" he asked. She shook her head slowly. "I wasn't angry." The confession seemed to surprise even him. Rebecca frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" Daniel considered the question carefully. "I think I realized something in that moment," he said. "What?" "That I haven't been paying attention." Rebecca blinked. The answer was not what she expected. Daniel walked back to the counter and leaned against it again. "For years I assumed we were steady," he continued. Rebecca lowered her gaze. "You mean boring?" Daniel gave a small shrug. "Predictable." The word hung between them. Rebecca stared into her tea. "Sometimes predictable feels like invisible." Daniel studied her expression. That sentence told him more than everything she had said earlier. "You feel invisible?" he asked quietly. Rebecca let out a soft breath. "I used to perform on stage in front of hundreds of people," she said. "Now most of my days are meetings about fonts and color palettes." Daniel didn't interrupt. "And when I come home," she continued, "you're usually reading case files or answering emails." Her voice softened. "Sometimes I wonder if we've become two people who just live in the same building." Daniel absorbed the words slowly. He had spent most of his career learning how to read what people avoided saying in courtrooms. Tonight, he realized Rebecca had been speaking quietly for years. He simply hadn't been listening. "Is Adrian the first person you told that to?" he asked. Rebecca hesitated. The pause answered the question before she spoke. "Yes." Daniel nodded once. Not surprised. Not angry. Just confirming something. Rebecca looked up at him, uncertainty flickering across her face. "Why are you being so calm about this?" Daniel picked up his mug again. "Because yelling won't make the truth clearer." She studied him carefully. "You think there's more to this?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward the kitchen table where his phone rested. The screen lit briefly when he picked it up. Rebecca watched him. "What is it?" Daniel turned the phone face down on the table. "Nothing you need to worry about tonight." Rebecca felt the distance in the sentence. "Daniel," he met her eyes again. "Rebecca," he said gently, "are you having an affair?" The directness of the question sucked the air out of the room. Rebecca's fingers tightened around her mug. "I don't know," she whispered. Daniel held her gaze. For the first time that evening, something in his expression finally shifted. Not anger, not accusation, something closer to sadness. He nodded slowly. "That's an honest answer." Neither of them spoke after that. Outside, the quiet Brooklyn street carried on as if nothing had changed. But inside the townhouse, the silence between them had grown into something neither of them could easily cross. Daniel eventually turned off the kitchen light. Rebecca remained at the counter long after he went upstairs, staring at the faint reflection of herself in the darkened window. For the first time, she realized that the night at the restaurant hadn't been the moment her marriage began to crack. It had only been the moment someone finally noticed. 3 months earlier, Rebecca Morgan had not been thinking about betrayal. At that time, the biggest concern in her professional life was a rebranding pitch scheduled for Monday morning. The conference room at Whitmore and Grant Marketing overlooked Midtown Manhattan. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a skyline of glass towers and restless traffic. The room smelled faintly of coffee and dry erase markers. Rebecca stood near the presentation screen, adjusting the slide deck. Across the table, her junior designer was nervously tapping a pen. "This company is moving fast," he said. "Their valuation doubled in less than a year." Rebecca nodded, though the numbers didn't interest her nearly as much as the creative possibilities. The brand was called Nexacore, a fast-growing artificial intelligence infrastructure startup. Their technology was complicated, their messaging confusing, and their public image almost non-existent. which meant opportunity. Rebecca liked messy brands. They gave her something to rebuild. Relax, she told the designer. We're not pitching to the Supreme Court. He smiled nervously. Still, tech founders can be unpredictable. Rebecca had met enough executives to know that was true. Some were arrogant. Some were socially awkward. Some simply treated marketing like a decorative afterthought. She expected Adrian Blake to fall into one of those categories. She was wrong. The meeting began 10 minutes later. The conference room door opened, and Adrian Blake walked in with two members of his executive team. He was taller than she expected. Early 40s, athletic build, navy suit without a tie. His posture carried the kind of relaxed confidence often found in people who had built something from nothing. But what Rebecca noticed first was his attention. Not the superficial kind. The real kind. When Rebecca began speaking, Adrian actually listened. Most clients checked their phones during presentations. Some interrupted with technical questions meant more to impress colleagues than to improve the work. Adrian did neither. He leaned forward slightly, eyes focused on the screen, occasionally nodding as she explained the brand strategy. Halfway through the presentation, Rebecca realized something unusual. She was enjoying herself, not simply performing a pitch, actually enjoying the conversation. When she described the emotional narrative behind the rebrand, the idea that Nexacore's technology was not just infrastructure, but the invisible nervous system of modern data, Adrian's eyes lit up. That's exactly what we've been trying to say, he said. Rebecca smiled. Then we're on the same page. After the meeting ended, most of the team filtered out of the room. Adrian stayed behind. He walked slowly around the table, studying the mock-ups displayed on the screen. You understand the company better than most investors do, he said. Rebecca shrugged slightly. That's the job. Adrian turned toward her. No, he said. Most people sell a story. You actually listened first. The compliment landed differently than the ones she usually heard. Rebecca had spent years navigating polite professional praise. This felt sincere. Listening is cheaper than redoing the entire campaign later, she replied lightly. Adrian laughed. The sound was warm, unguarded. Fair point. There was a pause then. The kind of quiet moment that could either become awkward or meaningful depending on what happened next. Adrian broke it. Do you always care this much about your clients? Rebecca hesitated. I care about good work. That's not the same thing. She tilted her head slightly. What do you mean? Adrian gestured toward the screen. You talked about the brand like it was a person. Most marketing agencies talk about numbers. Rebecca considered the comment. I used to be an actress, she said after a moment. Adrian raised an eyebrow. Really? She nodded. Off-Broadway mostly. Years ago. What happened? Rebecca looked briefly toward the window where traffic moved like veins of light through the city. Life happened. Adrian didn't push further. Instead, he said something unexpected. I can see it. See what? The performer. Rebecca laughed softly. That sounds worse than you think. No, Adrian said gently. I mean, you understand emotion. That's rare in business. The conversation shifted after that. What had started as a client meeting slowly turned into something more relaxed. They talked about creative work, about the strange pressure of building careers in New York, about the exhaustion of always needing to succeed. Rebecca found herself speaking more openly than she normally would with a new client. Adrian never interrupted. He simply listened. The meeting lasted nearly an hour longer than scheduled. Eventually, Adrian glanced at his watch. I've stolen enough of your afternoon, he said. Rebecca gathered her laptop. Creative work rarely ends on time. Adrian smiled. Then maybe we should continue the conversation over dinner sometime. Strictly professional. Rebecca paused. Client dinners were common. Routine, even. But something about the way he asked made the moment feel slightly different. Not inappropriate. Just personal. Sure, she said finally. Great, Adrian replied. They exchanged numbers for scheduling. As Rebecca watched him leave the conference room, she told herself the meeting had been simple. Professional. Nothing more. Yet later that evening, while standing in the quiet kitchen of the Brooklyn townhouse, she caught herself replaying the conversation. Not the business details. The way Adrian had listened. The way he noticed things. Daniel was upstairs in his study reading case files. Rebecca could hear the faint rustle of papers through the ceiling. For a long time she stood there in the kitchen holding her phone. Finally, a new message appeared. Adrian, looking forward to working together. And to that dinner. Rebecca stared at the message longer than necessary. Then she typed a short reply. Me too. At the time, it felt harmless. Just another client. Just another project. But months later, standing in the quiet kitchen after the restaurant confrontation, Rebecca would realize something uncomfortable. The affair had not started with a touch. It had started with attention. And attention, when someone has been feeling invisible for a long time, can feel dangerously close to love. The morning after the restaurant dinner began like most mornings in New York. Cold air drifted between the buildings along Pearl Street, and the courthouse steps were already crowded with lawyers clutching coffee cups and leather briefcases. Yellow taxis pushed through early traffic while the East River reflected a pale gray sky. Daniel Carter arrived at the federal building just before 8. Routine had always been his anchor. He greeted the security officer at the entrance with a familiar nod, rode the elevator to the 9th floor, and stepped into the quiet corridor of the U.S. Attorney's office. Inside his office, the lights hummed softly overhead. Stacks of legal briefs sat neatly arranged on his desk. A framed photograph of Daniel and Rebecca, taken years earlier on a summer trip to Maine, rested beside a thick case file. Daniel removed his coat and hung it carefully on the rack behind the door. For several seconds he stood still. Then he sat down and opened the file he had looked at briefly the night before. The name appeared again on the first page. Adrian Blake, CEO, Nexacore Technologies. Daniel leaned back in his chair, reading slowly. The investigation was still preliminary. No indictments. No formal charges. Just a series of financial irregularities flagged by the Department of Justice's Cybercrime Division. Government contracts. Data infrastructure partnerships. Suspicious transfers routed through shell companies. The kind of patterns prosecutors learned to notice long before anything reached a courtroom. Daniel flipped to the next page. An internal memo summarized the issue. Nexacore had recently secured several lucrative federal technology contracts. Their AI infrastructure platform was being integrated into multiple government systems. But an anonymous whistleblower had reported something unusual. Certain data processing metrics submitted by Nexacore appeared manipulated, numbers inflated to justify larger payments. If true, it meant fraud, possibly at a massive scale. Daniel rubbed his temple. 3 months ago the case would have been just another file. Now the situation felt complicated. His phone buzzed softly on the desk. A message from Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Kim. Morning. Quick meeting at 9 about the Nexacore review. Daniel stared at the screen for a moment before typing a short reply. On my way. He closed the file and stood. The hallway outside his office was beginning to fill with the quiet rhythm of the workday. Staff attorneys arriving, investigators discussing case notes, the distant hum of printers. Rachel Kim's office sat near the end of the corridor. She looked up from her laptop as Daniel stepped inside. Morning, she said. Rachel had built a reputation inside the office for being both meticulous and fearless in court. At 38, she had already helped secure several high-profile convictions involving financial crimes. Daniel took a seat across from her desk. You've been looking into Nexacore? He asked. Rachel nodded. Still early stages. She turned her laptop slightly so he could see the screen. Several financial charts filled the display. The whistleblower report came in 2 weeks ago, she explained. At first it looked like routine accounting errors. But the deeper we go, the stranger the numbers get. Daniel studied the charts. Inflated performance metrics? Exactly. Rachel leaned back in her chair. The company claims their AI infrastructure processes certain data loads faster than competitors. That's how they won several federal contracts. And the numbers are fake? We're not sure yet, she said carefully. But something's off. Daniel remained quiet. Rachel watched him for a moment. You know the CEO, don't you? Daniel looked up. What makes you say that? Rachel shrugged slightly. You paused when I mentioned his name yesterday. Daniel considered the question. In New York, tech founders show up at enough public events that their faces become familiar. Rachel accepted the explanation without pressing further. For now, we're just gathering documentation, she continued. Financial statements, internal communications, engineering reports. Daniel nodded. If the data manipulation is intentional, it could qualify as federal fraud. Rachel closed the laptop. Exactly. There was a brief silence between them. Then Rachel added casually. Apparently the CEO has been expanding fast lately. Big marketing push too. Daniel's attention sharpened slightly. Marketing. Rachel nodded. New branding campaign. Billboards going up next month. Daniel felt a faint tightening in his chest. Rebecca's agency. Whitmore and Grant. He kept his expression neutral. Rapid expansion often creates pressure to exaggerate performance, he said. Rachel gave a small smile. That's the polite way of putting it. She glanced at her watch. I'll keep you updated as we get more documents. Daniel stood. Good. As he reached the door, Rachel added one more comment. Oh, and Daniel? He turned. If this turns into a full investigation, it could get messy. Nexacor's been cozying up to some powerful people. Daniel nodded. I'm used to messy. Back in his office, Daniel closed the door quietly behind him. He walked to the window overlooking the narrow street below. For a long moment, he said nothing. Two different images occupied his mind. Rebecca sitting across from Adrian at the restaurant. The Nexacor file sitting on his desk. Daniel returned to the chair and opened the file again. The professional side of his mind began working through possibilities. If Nexacor had manipulated federal data reports, the case could become one of the largest technology fraud investigations in years. Which meant Adrian Blake was not just a man who had held his wife's hand. He was potentially the center of a federal crime. Daniel stared at the page. The overlap between his personal life and his work was no longer theoretical. It was real and dangerous. He closed the file slowly. Somewhere across the river, Rebecca was likely starting her day at the agency, reviewing campaign concepts for the same company now sitting inside a federal investigation folder. For the first time since the restaurant, Daniel allowed himself to acknowledge the truth forming quietly in his mind. If he pursued the investigation, he might destroy Adrian Blake's career. And in the process, he might also destroy whatever remained of his marriage. Daniel rested his hands on the desk. Then he reached for the phone. He didn't call Rebecca. Instead, he dialed the number of one of the investigators assigned to the Nexacor review. Morning, Daniel said calmly when the call connected. I want everything we have on Adrian Blake. The email arrived just after 3 in the afternoon. Daniel noticed it immediately because it carried a subject line investigators rarely used unless something had shifted. Nexacor, internal engineering audit, preliminary findings. He closed the legal brief he had been reviewing and opened the attachment. The report was longer than he expected. Technical language filled most of the first few pages. Data throughput calculations, performance benchmarks, algorithm efficiency reports. Daniel skimmed through those sections quickly. Years of prosecuting financial crimes had taught him where to focus. Near the middle of the report, a highlighted paragraph stopped him. Performance metrics submitted to federal procurement offices appear inconsistent with raw system output logs. Daniel read the sentence twice. He continued scrolling. Another section detailed discrepancies between internal server records and the numbers Nexacor had submitted in federal contract bids. In simple terms, the company claimed their AI systems process government data nearly twice as efficiently as competing platforms. The raw logs suggested otherwise. Daniel leaned back slowly. Inflated numbers meant larger contracts. Larger contracts meant millions of federal dollars. If the manipulation was deliberate, it wasn't just aggressive marketing. It was fraud. His phone buzzed a moment later. The investigator he had called earlier, Marcus Delgado, appeared on the screen. Daniel answered. What did you find? Marcus spoke without preamble. More than we expected. Daniel glanced back at the report. I'm looking at the audit now. Then you saw the numbers. Yes. There was a brief pause before Marcus continued. We also pulled internal communications from a former engineer who left the company last year. Daniel's attention sharpened. Emails, Slack messages, some internal documents. And Marcus exhaled slowly. Someone inside Nexacor knew the numbers were wrong. Daniel said nothing. That's not unusual, Marcus added. Engineers complain about management decisions all the time. But the engineer claims Adrian Blake personally approved the adjusted performance reports. Daniel's eyes settled on Adrian's name printed across the first page of the report. You're confident about the source? Daniel asked. So far, yes. We're verifying everything. Daniel leaned forward, elbows resting on the desk. Keep digging, he said. You thinking about opening a full investigation? Not yet. Marcus understood the hesitation. Something else going on? Daniel's voice remained calm. Just make sure the evidence is clean. Understood. The call ended. For several seconds, Daniel sat motionless. Then he closed the report and placed it neatly on top of the Nexacore file. Outside his office window, the afternoon light had begun to fade behind the buildings. If Adrian Blake had knowingly falsified government data reports, the consequences would be enormous. Federal fraud charges, corporate collapse, possibly prison. Daniel stared at the file again. The image of Rebecca sitting across from Adrian in the restaurant resurfaced in his mind. Her hand in his, the quiet way she had laughed. Daniel pressed his fingers briefly against the bridge of his nose. He had prosecuted dozens of cases like this, but never one that reached so directly into his own home. Across the East River, Rebecca Morgan was finishing a meeting in a glass-walled conference room at Whitmore and Grant. Creative mock-ups covered the table, billboard concepts, digital campaign visuals, new typography proposals for the Nexacore brand. Her team had been working nonstop for 2 weeks preparing the launch strategy. Adrian sat beside her reviewing the designs. This one, he said, tapping the tablet screen. The tagline feels stronger. Rebecca nodded thoughtfully. Because it sounds human. He smiled. That's your influence. The room had emptied a few minutes earlier when the rest of the team left to prepare revisions. Now only the two of them remained. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, stretching slightly. The day had been long. Adrian watched her for a moment before speaking. You seemed distracted earlier. Rebecca hesitated. Just tired. He studied her expression. You're a terrible liar. She laughed softly. That's unfair. No, Adrian said gently. That's observational. Rebecca looked down at the design board again. Daniel saw us last night. Adrian's expression changed immediately. At the restaurant. She nodded. What happened? Rebecca exhaled slowly. He walked over to the table. Adrian frowned. That must have been awkward. You could say that. What did he say? Rebecca gave a small, almost disbelieving smile. That you should know I'm allergic to cilantro. Adrian blinked. That's it. That's it. He leaned back in his chair, trying to process the story. That's surprisingly calm. Rebecca stared at the conference room window where dusk was beginning to settle over Manhattan. That's what scares me. Adrian didn't answer right away. Finally, he asked quietly, Are you okay? Rebecca nodded automatically, but after a moment she added, I'm not sure. The room fell silent again. Outside, the city lights flickered on one by one. Adrian reached for his phone on the table. I should probably get going, he said. Rebecca nodded. As he stood, he paused. You know, he said gently, if things become difficult with Daniel. He didn't finish the sentence. Rebecca met his eyes. The unfinished thought hovered between them. A possibility neither of them had fully spoken aloud yet. Adrian slipped on his coat. Call me if you need anything. Rebecca watched him leave the conference room. For a long moment she remained alone at the table, staring at the Nexacore campaign designs spread across the surface. A company built on invisible systems, invisible connections, invisible truths. Across the river, Daniel Carter closed his office for the evening. The Nexacore file remained in his briefcase as he walked toward the elevator. The investigation was no longer theoretical. Evidence was beginning to form, and every new document seemed to tighten the invisible thread connecting Adrian Blake, Nexacore, and Daniel's own marriage. The elevator doors closed. Daniel watched his reflection in the metal panel. For the first time since opening the case file, a troubling realization settled quietly in his mind. If the investigation moved forward, Rebecca might not simply be involved emotionally. She might become a witness. Or worse. Rebecca left the office later than usual that evening. By the time she stepped out onto Madison Avenue, The city had already slipped into its nighttime rhythm. The sidewalks were crowded with people moving quickly between restaurants and subway entrances, their conversations blending into the constant hum of traffic. Cold air brushed against her face. She pulled her coat tighter and walked without a clear destination. Her phone buzzed in her hand. Adrian. She hesitated before answering. Hey, she said softly. Still at the office? Adrian asked. Just left. There was a brief pause. I'm a few blocks away, he said. Coffee. Rebecca glanced down the street. It would be easy. Too easy. Okay, she said. The cafe was quiet when she arrived. Most of the evening crowd had already moved on to bars and restaurants, leaving only a few people hunched over laptops in the dim corner booths. Adrian was sitting near the window. He stood when he saw her. You look exhausted, he said. Rebecca slid into the chair across from him. I feel exhausted. He studied her face for a moment. Is it Daniel? She nodded. Adrian waited. Rebecca traced the rim of her coffee cup with her finger. He asked me if I was having an affair. Adrian's expression tightened slightly. And what did you say? Rebecca gave a small, uncertain laugh. I told him I didn't know. That's honest, Adrian said quietly. Or cowardly. Adrian leaned forward. Rebecca, you're in a complicated situation. That's one way to describe it. He watched her carefully. What do you want? The question landed with surprising force. Rebecca opened her mouth to answer, but stopped, because the truth felt unclear even to her. I don't know yet, she admitted. Adrian didn't look disappointed. Instead, he nodded slowly. That's fair. Rebecca studied him. Why are you being so patient about this? Adrian shrugged lightly. Because I don't want to be another pressure in your life. His voice softened. I just want you to be honest about what you feel. Rebecca looked down at the table. For months, Adrian had been the person who listened without interruption, without judgment. It was a feeling she had almost forgotten existed. But tonight something felt different. He reached across the table and gently touched her hand. The same gesture Daniel had seen at the restaurant. Rebecca didn't pull away immediately, yet the contact no longer felt simple. Her mind flashed briefly to the quiet kitchen at home. Daniel standing near the window. The calm way he had asked his question. Are you having an affair? Rebecca slowly withdrew her hand. Adrian noticed. What's wrong? She shook her head. Nothing. That didn't look like nothing. Rebecca sighed. I keep thinking about Daniel's face at the restaurant. Was he angry? No. Then what? She searched for the right word. Sad. Adrian leaned back in his chair. Rebecca, I know, she said quickly. You don't need to say it. What do you think I'm going to say? That I should leave him? Adrian shook his head. That's not my decision to make. Rebecca blinked in surprise. You've never suggested that. No. Why not? Adrian considered the question carefully. Because relationships that start by destroying another one rarely begin clean. The honesty caught her off guard. So what are we doing? She asked quietly. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. I think we're two people who met at the wrong moment in our lives. The sentence settled heavily between them. Rebecca felt something tighten in her chest. That sounds like the beginning of a goodbye. Or the beginning of clarity. Adrian replied gently. Neither of them spoke after that. Outside the cafe window, headlights slid across the pavement like slow-moving stars. Rebecca eventually stood. I should go home. Adrian nodded. Call me when you get there. She hesitated. I might not. That's okay, he said. Rebecca stepped outside into the cold night air. The subway ride back to Brooklyn felt longer than usual. By the time she reached Willow Street, the neighborhood had fallen into quiet suburban stillness. Most of the brownstones were dark except for the occasional warm glow of living room lamps. Their house stood halfway down the block. Rebecca paused at the gate before walking up the steps. Inside, the lights were still on. Daniel was sitting in the living room when she entered. A legal file rested open on the coffee table. He looked up. You're home late. Rebecca removed her coat slowly. Work. Daniel nodded. Neither of them mentioned Adrian. The silence between them felt strangely fragile, like glass that might crack if either of them spoke too loudly. Rebecca sat on the opposite end of the couch. Daniel closed the file. Long day, he asked. Yes. He studied her face briefly. Rebecca. She looked at him. For what it's worth, Daniel said quietly, I'm not trying to trap you. The statement surprised her. What do you mean? If you decide this marriage isn't what you want anymore, I'd rather hear the truth. Rebecca felt her throat tighten. That's not what I said. No, Daniel replied gently. But it's the question we're both avoiding. The room fell silent again. Rebecca suddenly realized how strange the moment was. Two people who had shared 15 years of life sitting less than 6 feet apart, and yet separated by a distance neither of them quite understood. Daniel eventually stood and gathered the documents from the table. I have an early meeting tomorrow. Rebecca nodded. As he walked toward the stairs, she spoke softly. Daniel. He stopped. Yes. She wanted to say something meaningful, something that might repair the fragile space between them, but the words refused to form. Nothing, she said finally. Daniel gave a small nod and continued upstairs. Rebecca remained on the couch. In the quiet house, she felt the weight of two very different futures pressing gently against her thoughts. One offered excitement and attention. The other offered history and quiet loyalty. And somewhere between those two worlds, Rebecca Morgan realized she was standing on a line she could not remain on forever. Soon, she would have to choose a direction. Adrian Blake rarely stayed at the office past midnight. Running a technology company required long hours, but Adrian had learned years earlier that exhaustion blurred judgment. Most nights, he forced himself to leave before the city lights turned harsh and the office towers emptied. Tonight was different. The Nexacor headquarters occupied 3 floors of a modern glass building near Bryant Park. The office had been designed to project confidence. Open workspaces, polished concrete floors, minimalist furniture. Now the space felt strangely hollow. Most of the employees had gone home hours earlier. Only a few dim desk lamps remained lit across the floor. Adrian stood near the window in his private office, staring down at the city traffic moving through Midtown like restless veins of light. His phone sat on the desk behind him. Rebecca's name glowed on the screen. He had asked her to come. Not for dinner. Not for a casual conversation. For honesty. 20 minutes later, the elevator doors opened at the end of the hallway. Rebecca stepped into the office floor. The quiet surprised her. She walked slowly toward Adrian's office, her heels echoing softly across the polished floor. He turned when he heard her approach. Thanks for coming. Rebecca slipped her coat off and draped it over the back of a chair. You sounded serious on the phone. I am. She studied his face. The easy confidence she had grown used to seeing was still there, but something beneath it had shifted. Tension. What's going on? She asked. Adrian gestured toward the couch. Sit for a minute. Rebecca sat, though the seriousness in his voice made her uneasy. Adrian remained standing for a moment before finally lowering himself into the chair opposite her. He ran a hand slowly through his hair. I should have told you this earlier, he said. Rebecca felt a small knot form in her stomach. Told me what? Adrian hesitated. For someone who usually spoke with effortless clarity, the pause felt unusual. Have you ever heard the phrase, too fast to fail? He asked. Rebecca frowned. I've heard too big to fail. Adrian gave a faint smile. In tech startups, the version is different. Companies grow so quickly that no one stops to ask if the foundation is stable. Rebecca waited. Nexacor grew very fast, he continued. You've mentioned that. What I haven't mentioned, Adrian said quietly, is how much pressure that growth created. Rebecca leaned forward slightly. What kind of pressure? Investors, government contracts, competition. Adrian glanced briefly toward the window again. When a company becomes successful quickly, people expect the next milestone immediately, and the next, and the next. Rebecca understood that much. So you hired more engineers, she said. We did, and expanded the platform. Yes. She looked confused. That still doesn't sound like a problem. Adrian rested his elbows on his knees. Unless the technology isn't advancing as quickly as investors believe it is. The sentence settled heavily between them. Rebecca stared at him. What are you saying? Adrian exhaled slowly. I'm saying Nexacor promised certain performance capabilities that the platform hasn't fully reached yet. Rebecca felt her chest tighten. Adrian. He held up a hand gently. Let me finish. She nodded reluctantly. For the last year, we've been adjusting certain performance reports, Adrian continued. Not dramatically. just enough to show progress while the engineers caught up. Rebecca's voice dropped. That sounds like falsifying data. Adrian didn't deny it. In business, they call it optimistic reporting. In court, they call it fraud, Rebecca said quietly. The word lingered in the room. Adrian met her eyes. You sound like Daniel. Rebecca looked away. That's not a coincidence. Silence filled the office. The city lights flickered across the windows behind them. Rebecca felt the world she had associated with Adrian shifting into something more complicated. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Adrian leaned back slowly. Because something changed this week. What? We've received inquiries. Rebecca's pulse quickened. Inquiries from who? Adrian hesitated. Federal investigators. The word struck her harder than she expected. For a moment, she couldn't speak. Daniel's face appeared in her mind. His office. The legal files. His calm voice asking questions. You think the government is investigating Nexacor? She said slowly. I know they are. Rebecca's hands felt cold. Do you know who's handling the case? Not yet. But even as Adrian said it, Rebecca felt an uncomfortable intuition forming. What happens if they prove the numbers were manipulated? She asked. Adrian's expression grew distant. Then Nexacor collapses. And you? Adrian didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said quietly, then I become the man responsible. The weight of the confession settled across the room. Rebecca stood and walked toward the window. Below them, the lights of Manhattan moved endlessly through the night. So what are you going to do? She asked. Adrian rose slowly behind her. I'm trying to fix it before the investigation goes further. Can you? I don't know. Rebecca turned to face him. And where do I fit into this? Adrian's voice softened. You shouldn't. The honesty startled her. You should walk away from me before this becomes public. Rebecca studied him carefully. You're telling me to leave? I'm telling you to protect yourself. The room fell silent again. Rebecca realized something strange in that moment. For months, she had seen Adrian as an escape from the quiet complications of her marriage. Now he looked like a man standing at the edge of a collapsing building, and she was close enough to fall with him. Far across the river, Daniel Carter sat alone in his office reviewing the same Nexacor files. Piece by piece, the investigation was tightening. Evidence, financial reports, internal communications, and at the center of it all, the name Adrian Blake. Daniel closed the file slowly. Somewhere in Manhattan, Rebecca was likely still working late with the man whose company might soon face federal charges. Daniel stared out the window at the dark river separating Brooklyn from Manhattan. The city looked calm from a distance. But beneath the quiet surface, something much larger had already begun moving. And soon, all three of them would be pulled into it. The meeting began at 9 sharp. Inside the conference room of the U.S. Attorney's office, the blinds were half drawn against the gray morning light. A long table divided the room, scattered with legal pads, laptops, and printed documents. Daniel Carter took his seat near the center. Across from him sat Rachel Kim, 2 cybercrime investigators, and an analyst from the Department of Justice's Technology Division. The Nexacor file rested in front of Daniel, thicker than it had been the day before. Rachel opened the meeting. Over the past 48 hours, we've verified several elements from the whistleblower report, she said. She tapped a key on her laptop, projecting a chart onto the screen. A timeline of Nexacor's government contracts appeared, each contract larger than the last. Federal procurement records show Nexacor secured 3 major infrastructure agreements within 18 months, Rachel continued. The analyst beside her added, those contracts were awarded largely based on performance claims submitted during technical evaluations. Daniel studied the chart. And those claims don't match the raw data. The analyst nodded. Correct. Rachel folded her hands on the table. We also confirmed internal communications suggesting senior leadership was aware of the discrepancy. The room grew quieter. One of the investigators slid a printed document across the table. Slack message archive, he said. Daniel glanced down. The messages were from an internal Nexacor engineering channel. One line had been highlighted. If we submit the real numbers, we lose the contract. Another message followed. Adrian approved the revised report. Daniel felt the weight of the sentence settle heavily in the room. Rachel broke the silence. At this point, we have enough to open a formal investigation. The analyst nodded. Subpoenas, financial audits, internal records. Daniel remained still. Rachel turned toward him. You're the senior prosecutor on financial fraud this quarter. If we move forward, you'd normally lead the case. The word normally hung in the air. Daniel understood the implication immediately. Professional protocol required disclosure of any potential conflict of interest. Rachel studied him carefully. Daniel. He met her gaze. There may be a conflict. The room quieted even further. Rachel tilted her head slightly. What kind of conflict? Daniel spoke calmly. My wife's marketing agency is currently working with Nexicor. The investigators exchanged quick glances. Rachel nodded slowly. That's relevant. Daniel continued. She's not part of the company's leadership, but her firm is handling their branding campaign. Rachel leaned back in her chair. Do you think your wife has access to internal information? I don't know. And Adrian Blake? Daniel paused briefly. I've met him once. Rachel understood the significance of the sentence. Socially? Daniel gave a small nod. Rachel considered the situation carefully. In that case, she said slowly, you may want to recuse yourself. Daniel didn't respond immediately. The idea made logical sense. Prosecutors avoided conflicts whenever possible. But something about stepping away from the case unsettled him. Because if he withdrew, the investigation would continue without him. And he would lose visibility into how deeply Rebecca might be connected. Rachel watched his expression. Daniel, this isn't about competence, she added. It's about optics. I understand. One of the investigators spoke up. We could assign the case to another division. Daniel looked down at the file again. Adrian Blake's name appeared repeatedly throughout the documents. CEO, decision authority, approval of performance reports. The professional part of Daniel's mind understood the legal gravity. But another part of him, quieter, more personal, was thinking about Rebecca. If the investigation moved forward, the Nexicor scandal would eventually become public. And when it did, Rebecca's professional connection to the company might drag her name into the story. Rachel spoke again. You don't have to decide today. Daniel closed the file. No, he said quietly. I think I do. The room waited. Daniel lifted his eyes. I'll disclose the conflict formally and recuse myself. Rachel nodded once. That's the safest option. The meeting ended shortly after. As Daniel walked back to his office, the hallway felt unusually long. Inside his office, he sat at his desk and stared briefly at the blank computer screen. Recusal was the right decision. Professional, ethical, necessary. Yet something about it felt unfinished. Because the investigation might no longer be his responsibility. But its consequences would still reach his home. That evening, the Brooklyn townhouse felt quieter than usual. Rebecca was already in the kitchen when Daniel arrived. She was standing by the sink rinsing a wine glass. You're home early, she said without turning around. Daniel set his briefcase on the table. The Nexicor case became official today. Rebecca froze. The glass in her hand remained suspended under the running water. What do you mean? Federal investigation. Rebecca slowly turned. Her expression had gone pale. Daniel noticed immediately. You knew something like this might happen, he said gently. Rebecca swallowed. Yes. Daniel watched her carefully. You spoke with Adrian. It wasn't a question. Rebecca set the glass down on the counter. He told me they've been under pressure. That's one way to describe it. Rebecca crossed her arms slightly. Daniel, how serious is it? Daniel considered the question. Serious enough that I recused myself from the case. Rebecca blinked. You stepped away? Yes. Because of me? Because of the conflict. Rebecca felt a strange mixture of relief and guilt. So someone else will handle the investigation? Yes. The kitchen fell quiet. Rebecca stared at the counter for a moment before asking softly, what happens to Adrian if they prove the numbers were falsified? Daniel's voice remained steady. He could face federal fraud charges. The words echoed in the room. Rebecca closed her eyes briefly. Daniel watched her. You care about him, he said. Rebecca didn't answer. Daniel continued quietly. I'm not asking you to justify anything. Rebecca opened her eyes again. Then what are you asking? Daniel held her gaze. I'm asking whether you're prepared for what happens next. Outside, a car passed slowly along the street. Rebecca felt the weight of the question pressing against her chest, because the truth was becoming impossible to avoid. The affair, the investigation, the fragile marriage she had spent 15 years building. 3 lives were now tangled together in ways none of them could easily escape. And the next decision she made might determine which of those lives would collapse first. The first subpoena arrived on a Tuesday morning. At Nexacor headquarters, the receptionist initially thought the envelope contained routine legal correspondence. Government agencies sent documents to technology companies all the time: regulatory questions, compliance reviews, data privacy requests. This envelope was different. By noon, the legal department had received 3 more. By 2 o'clock, Adrian Blake's phone had not stopped vibrating. When Rebecca arrived at the office that afternoon, the building felt different. The lobby security desk had a cluster of unfamiliar faces, lawyers speaking in hushed voices, assistants rushing between elevators. She stepped into the elevator slowly, unease rising in her chest. By the time the doors opened on Nexacor's floor, the tension was unmistakable. Employees spoke quietly near their desks. 2 men in suits she didn't recognize stood near the conference room, speaking with Nexacor's general counsel. Rebecca walked toward Adrian's office. His door was closed. She knocked once. "Come in," his voice said. Inside, the office looked like a war room. Legal documents covered the table. Adrian's laptop was open, several unread emails blinking across the screen. Adrian looked up when he saw her. "You shouldn't be here today." Rebecca closed the door behind her. "That's a strange way to greet someone." Adrian leaned back in his chair. "We've received subpoenas." Rebecca nodded slowly. "I heard." His eyes studied her carefully. "Your agency might want to pause the marketing campaign." Rebecca crossed her arms. "That's not why I came." Adrian sighed quietly. "I figured." Rebecca stepped closer to the desk. "How bad is it?" Adrian didn't answer immediately. He rubbed his hands together slowly, a gesture she had never seen from him before. "The Department of Justice wants internal communications, server logs, financial records." Rebecca felt her throat tighten. "That sounds comprehensive." "It is." "Do they know the numbers were manipulated?" Adrian's silence answered the question. Rebecca sat down across from him. "You told me the reports were adjusted." "They were. That's not what federal investigators call it." Adrian looked at her carefully. "You sound like Daniel again." Rebecca didn't respond. Instead, she asked the question that had been circling her thoughts for days. "How long have you known this investigation was coming?" Adrian hesitated. Rebecca felt the answer forming before he spoke. "A few weeks," he admitted. The room seemed to tilt slightly. "You knew," she whispered. "Yes." "And you still—" She stopped herself. "Still what?" Adrian asked quietly. Rebecca forced the words out. "You still let this happen between us." Adrian leaned forward. "Rebecca, you knew the company might collapse. You knew there could be criminal charges." His voice sharpened slightly. "I didn't know how serious it would become. But you knew enough." The silence that followed was heavy. Adrian's expression softened. "I didn't plan for this to happen." Rebecca laughed once under her breath. "Neither did I." Adrian studied her face. "Are you angry?" Rebecca thought about the question. Surprisingly, anger wasn't the emotion dominating her thoughts. Something else was. Disillusionment. "I thought you were the stable one," she said quietly. Adrian frowned. "What does that mean?" Rebecca gestured vaguely toward the window where the skyline stretched endlessly across Manhattan. "You were the person who had everything figured out." Adrian gave a faint, humorless smile. "Trust me, Rebecca. Nobody running a startup has everything figured out." She leaned back in her chair. "That's not what you showed me." Adrian's voice softened. "I showed you the part of my life that worked." Rebecca looked down at the documents scattered across his desk. Government letterhead, legal requests, deadlines. The reality of Adrian's world no longer looked like the exciting escape she had imagined months earlier. "You asked me why I cared about you," Adrian said quietly. Rebecca looked up. "Yes. This is why." He gestured around the office. "Because when you walked into that conference room months ago, you weren't impressed by any of this." Rebecca blinked. "You were the first person who talked to me like I wasn't the CEO of anything," Adrian continued. "You were just another client," she said. "Exactly." Rebecca felt something complicated twist in her chest, because she suddenly understood something that had been invisible before. Adrian hadn't simply offered her attention. He had needed it just as much. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked. Adrian looked down at the desk. "Because I didn't want you to see me like this." Rebecca followed his gaze to the subpoenas again. A man under investigation. A company on the edge of scandal. "Adrian," she said quietly, "Daniel already knows about the investigation." Adrian's head lifted immediately. "What?" He recused himself from the case. Adrian stared at her. "Your husband was involved?" "Not anymore." Adrian leaned back slowly. The implications of the situation spread across his thoughts. "So the man whose wife I'm involved with," Rebecca finished the sentence, "was almost the prosecutor who could have charged you." The room went silent. Outside the office window, the city continued its relentless movement. People walking, cars passing, lights flickering across thousands of windows. Adrian finally spoke again. "You should step away from this company." Rebecca nodded. "My agency probably will." "That's not what I meant." She met his eyes. "You mean step away from you?" Adrian didn't deny it. Rebecca felt an unexpected ache in her chest. Not because she wanted to stay, but because the illusion she had been holding on to was dissolving piece by piece. For months, she had believed Adrian represented a different life. Freedom, excitement, possibility. Now she saw the truth. He was simply another flawed man standing in the middle of a collapsing situation. And suddenly, the quiet stability of her marriage, once so easy to overlook, felt far more complicated to abandon. Rebecca stood slowly. "I should go." Adrian didn't try to stop her. As she reached the door, he spoke one final time. "Rebecca." She turned. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I never lied about how I feel about you." Rebecca held his gaze for a moment. Then she answered with a truth she had only just begun to understand. "That's not the part that scares me anymore." She left the office. And as the elevator carried her down through the silent floors of the building, Rebecca realized something she had avoided admitting for weeks. The story she believed she was living, the one where Adrian was the beginning of something new, had been built on a fragile illusion. And now that illusion was finally breaking apart. The news broke quietly at first. Not on television. Not as a dramatic headline. Just a small article buried on the financial page of an online business journal. Federal investigators reviewing Nexicor's government contracts. Rebecca saw it while scrolling through her phone during a morning train ride. The article was brief. Anonymous sources. Preliminary inquiry. Possible discrepancies in reported performance data. Most readers would have moved on without noticing. Rebecca couldn't. Her stomach tightened as she read each line. By the time the train pulled into Brooklyn, she already knew what would follow. Investigations rarely stayed quiet for long. And when they became public, every professional connection around the company would inevitably surface. That evening, she returned to the townhouse earlier than usual. The house was dimly lit when she stepped inside. Daniel was sitting in the living room, reading. A soft lamp cast warm light across the pages of a legal journal in his hands. For a moment, Rebecca stood in the doorway watching him. The scene looked so normal, it almost felt surreal. Daniel glanced up. "You're home early." Rebecca closed the door behind her. "We need to talk." Daniel studied her face. Something in her voice told him this conversation would be different from the quiet ones they had been having for days. He placed the journal on the table. "Okay." Rebecca sat down across from him. The room felt unusually still. "I saw the news this morning," she said. Daniel nodded once. "I expected it would leak." Rebecca watched him carefully. "You already knew." "Yes." The calmness in his voice no longer surprised her. Daniel had always lived comfortably with difficult truths. "I met Adrian today," she said. Daniel didn't interrupt. "He told me the subpoenas arrived." Daniel leaned back slightly. "That's how investigations begin." Rebecca's hands rested quietly in her lap. "Daniel, I need to tell you the truth." He waited. Rebecca inhaled slowly. "Adrian and I didn't just have dinner a few times." Daniel's expression remained composed. "I assumed that. We've been seeing each other for months." The words hovered in the room. Daniel looked at the floor for a moment. Not shocked. Not even particularly surprised. just absorbing the confirmation of something he had already sensed. Rebecca continued. It started during the Nexacore project. Daniel nodded faintly. You felt invisible, he said quietly. Rebecca blinked. You remember that. I listen more carefully than people think. Rebecca looked down. For a while I believed Adrian represented something different. Daniel didn't respond. He listened to me, she said. He noticed things. He made me feel. She struggled for the right word. Alive again. Daniel's gaze softened slightly. I understand that feeling. Rebecca looked up at him. You do? Yes. The answer surprised her. Daniel continued quietly. Being a prosecutor teaches you something strange about people. What? That most betrayals don't start with cruelty. Rebecca's chest tightened. They start with loneliness. The sentence filled the room. Rebecca felt tears gathering behind her eyes. I never wanted to hurt you. Daniel studied her face. I believe you. But I did. Yes. The honesty didn't feel cruel. Just factual. Rebecca wiped at her eyes quickly. I ended it today. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. With Adrian? Yes. He absorbed the information. Because of the investigation? Partly. And the other reason? Rebecca met his gaze. Because I finally realized I wasn't escaping anything. Daniel waited. I was just running from problems we never talked about. The room grew quiet again. Daniel stood and walked toward the window. Outside, the Brooklyn street was calm under the soft glow of streetlights. After a long moment he spoke. Do you love him? Rebecca felt the weight of the question settle across her thoughts. She considered the answer carefully. I cared about him, she said. That's not what I asked. Rebecca looked at him honestly. No. Daniel nodded slowly. The response seemed to release something inside him. Rebecca stood. Daniel, he turned. I know I broke something between us. Yes, he said softly. But I don't want to pretend the marriage was perfect before that. Daniel gave a faint smile. It wasn't. Rebecca stepped closer. So what happens now? Daniel looked at her for a long time. 15 years of memories moved quietly through his thoughts. Vacations, arguments, shared routines, 1,000 small moments that had built their life together. Finally he spoke. I think the honest answer, he said slowly, is that we don't know yet. Rebecca nodded. That uncertainty felt strangely real. Daniel returned to the couch and sat down again. The investigation will continue, he said. Yes. And Adrian's life is about to become very complicated. Rebecca lowered her gaze. I know. Daniel watched her carefully. You're worried about him. A little. That's understandable. Rebecca sat down again. The tension in the room had shifted. Not gone. Just transformed into something quieter. I'm sorry, she said softly. Daniel studied her face. I know. Outside, a breeze rustled the trees along the sidewalk. Inside the townhouse, the silence between them felt less like a wall and more like unfamiliar ground. Neither of them knew what the future would look like. But for the first time since the restaurant, the truth was finally in the room. And sometimes, Daniel thought quietly, truth was the only place a broken relationship could possibly begin to rebuild. The Nexacore story spread across the city within 2 weeks. At first it appeared in the business pages. Then the technology blogs picked it up. Soon the major newspapers followed. Federal investigation targets AI startup Nexacore. The articles described everything with the cold precision of journalism. Manipulated performance metrics. Inflated government contracts. Internal communications suggesting executive approval. Adrian Blake's photograph appeared beside nearly every story. A clean portrait taken during a conference the year before. Confident. Smiling. The image now carried a very different weight. Rebecca saw it one morning while sitting at the kitchen table. She closed the laptop slowly. Across from her, Daniel poured coffee into 2 mugs. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The weeks since their conversation had settled into an unfamiliar rhythm. Not the comfortable routine they once shared. Something quieter. More cautious. Daniel set a mug beside her. Thank you, Rebecca said. She glanced toward the staircase. The house felt larger lately. Or maybe simply emptier. Work at the marketing agency had shifted quickly after the investigation became public. Whitmore and Grant had terminated the Nexacore contract within days. Rebecca's team moved on to other projects, but the abrupt change left an uncomfortable silence in her schedule. Daniel returned to the table. The company's board forced Adrian to step down yesterday, he said. Rebecca nodded. I read that. Daniel watched her expression. You haven't spoken to him. It wasn't a question. No, Rebecca said quietly. Do you want to? Rebecca thought about it. A few weeks earlier the answer would have been immediate. Now the emotion had softened into something distant. I don't think it would help either of us. Daniel accepted the answer. Outside, a delivery truck rolled slowly past the townhouse. The morning light spread across the kitchen floor. Rebecca wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. What happens to him now, she asked. Daniel spoke carefully. The investigation will determine that. But realistically? Daniel considered the question. If the evidence holds, there will likely be charges. Rebecca absorbed the information silently. The version of Adrian she had known, the confident founder with limitless ambition, felt like a memory from a different life. You were right about something, she said after a moment. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. What's that? He wasn't an escape. Daniel waited. He was just another complicated person. Daniel gave a faint, understanding nod. Rebecca looked around the kitchen. The same kitchen where they had stood together thousands of times before. So, she said quietly, what about us? Daniel leaned back in his chair. The question had been waiting between them for weeks. I've been thinking about that, he admitted. Rebecca watched him closely. And Daniel spoke slowly. I don't think relationships survive betrayal by pretending it didn't happen. Rebecca nodded. I agree. But they also don't survive if betrayal becomes the only thing anyone remembers. Rebecca looked down at the table. Daniel continued. I think we're standing in a strange place right now. What kind of place? The one where two people decide whether they still want to know each other. Rebecca looked up. We already know each other. Daniel gave a small smile. Do we? The question wasn't sarcastic, just thoughtful. Rebecca considered it carefully. Maybe they had known each other once. But years of quiet routine had allowed parts of themselves to fade unnoticed. What are you suggesting? She asked. Daniel glanced toward the window. Maybe we start again. Rebecca frowned slightly. Start again? Not pretend we're new people, he clarified. Just become curious again. Rebecca let the idea settle in her mind. Curious. It sounded strangely simple. And strangely difficult. You really think that's possible? She asked. Daniel shrugged lightly. I think it's more honest than pretending nothing changed. Rebecca sat quietly for a long moment. The city outside continued its endless movement. Life in New York had a way of pushing forward no matter what individual stories unfolded inside its buildings. Finally, she said softly, I'd like that. Daniel nodded once. Neither of them moved closer. Neither of them reached for the other's hand. But the space between them felt different. Not healed. Not whole. Just open. Later that afternoon, Rebecca walked alone through Brooklyn Heights. The neighborhood trees had begun to show early signs of spring. Children played in a small park nearby while neighbors chatted quietly along the sidewalks. Life continuing in ordinary ways. She stopped briefly at the overlook above the East River. Across the water, Manhattan's skyline rose like a wall of glass and steel. Somewhere in that city, Adrian Blake was facing the consequences of choices that had once seemed small. Rebecca felt a quiet sadness about that. But she also understood something clearly now. Attention had drawn her away from her marriage. Loneliness had made that attention feel like love, and silence had allowed the distance between her and Daniel to grow unnoticed. But silence no longer existed between them. The truth had broken that. And strangely, that break had left room for something new. Behind her, the city moved forward. Ahead of her, the future remained uncertain. Rebecca turned and began walking home. Because sometimes the end of one story is simply the moment when another one quietly begins.